Hi, this is Matthew Baldwin of Mars Hill University, and you are watching Religion 201, The Bible as Literature, lecture number 8. This lecture comes in multiple parts, and this is part 1, and we're dealing with source criticism of the flood narrative in Genesis chapters 6 through 9, and also the question of the chronology of the flood, which, when looked at from a source critical perspective, is a little bit more complicated than it usually appears. Let's take a closer look. What I'm showing you here is the handout that I provided to the class, Genesis 6 to 9, a combination of 2 or more versions, or source criticism of Genesis 6 to 9. Scholars who work with source criticism of the Bible make a variety of assumptions. There's no universal agreement among scholars about how to resolve the question of the use of sources in the composition of Genesis and the other books of the Torah, but I have presented to you in another handout, Source Criticism, Understanding the Theory, the basics of how scholars typically talk about the different sources that, to their reading of the text, seem to appear in the text. Now, a lot of people, when focusing on the Bible, just read it through like a unified literary work. And indeed, I do advocate that we read it as a unified literary work. And I've already presented at least a partial reading of the flood story in lecture number 7, viewing it as a literary work in which the themes of the ethical wrestling with the problem of human violence and the problem of bloodshed in the world comes to the fore. And the story, as it appears in the book of Genesis, really is a very powerful and moving account of a serious problem in human being as God tries to wrestle with the broken creation and initially reacts with great grief at the violence of human beings, sends a destructive flood, bringing to an end all human life and animal life, and starts over with Noah in what's called the Noahide covenant, providing new rules to govern violence and bloodshed, which perhaps paradoxically involve the shedding of animal blood in the form of animal sacrifice, which is the kind of the guarantee for how humans will continue to exist without facing the destructive rage of God. The scholars who work with the source critical assumptions that I've already mentioned, when they read the account of the flood in Genesis 6 to 9, they can't help but notice some peculiar features. There are differences present even within Genesis 6 to 9 in what appears to a casual reader as a unified story. There are differences in the ways that the text speaks about the divine that are mostly clearly blocked out. It's almost as though, and I mentioned this in the beginning part of this handout, it's almost as though there are 2 different storytellers sitting with you, say, maybe at a campfire in a campsite in the desert. And the 2 different storytellers are competing with one another to tell the same story, the story of God and the flood, but they use different language to speak about the events of the flood, and they have different ideas about what exactly transpired and how long it took place. So if you'll just glance with me really quickly through this handout, I will explain quickly how to use the handout. And I'm going to avoid reading it in detail on this lecture because I don't have a whole the hour and a half that it would take me to walk you through line by line and explain everything. But I just want to explain what you're seeing. So what you see here is 2 columns, and the columns span about 8 pages of text. I have divided the text of Genesis 6 to 9 according to which divine name is primarily being used in each section of the text. As you can see, it doesn't always clearly break down, but there are large alternations between passages. Not every passage is associated directly with the use of a particular divine name, but there are also some other variations that are fairly clear. There are variations in theme and in interest and in language. In particular, if you look at this text, what I've got here is the Yahwist, or the J source, is lined up in the left-hand column. And the priestly source, or P source, which uses the word Elohim, or God, to refer to the divine being, is in the right-hand side. And what you'll see as you look through is that the story almost is told in full in two different versions when you break it up this way. You can read straight down the left-hand column from top to bottom across all 7 pages, and you will get an almost complete version of the flood story. And you can read down the column on the right-hand side, and you'll get an almost complete version of the flood story, actually a slightly more complete version of the flood story. In other words, what we really seem to have here is a P version of the flood story that's been supplemented, cut in with, if you will, important materials that come from the J version. The P version is the more complete of the two. I'll start by really quickly running through what I take to be the distinctive features of the J version of the flood story. In the J version of the flood story, Yahweh is concerned with the heart of human beings, which is inclined towards evil and wickedness. It uses the language of blotting out life from the earth. And that language of blotting out appears throughout the text. Noah, it says, finds favor in the sight of Yahweh, and then is told to go into the ark with 7 pairs of every clean animal and 2 pairs of all the non-clean animals. The Lord tells Noah that he will send rain after a 7-day waiting period. He will send rain that will rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, blotting out everything on the face of the earth. 7 days later, the rain waters come. The rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights. The floods continue during that 40-day period, and everything dies, being blotted out. At the end of 40 days in the J version, Noah sends out birds to try to determine whether or not the waters have abated. At first, he sends out a raven and a dove. The raven doesn't come back, but the dove does come back. Assuming that this means that the dove found no place to rest, Noah waits 7 more days and then sends out the dove again. The dove comes back to him that time, and this time it brings back an olive branch from a tree. And so Noah waits 7 more days, and then he exits the ark. He builds an altar to Yahweh. He sacrifices from the clean animals that he has brought, the 7 pairs of clean animals, because of course you can't, if you sacrifice an animal that you've only brought 1 breeding pair for, you've just made that animal extinct. So the Yahwist source has Yahweh, of course, helpfully tell Noah to bring 7 pairs, 7 being that magical biblical number. And then Yahweh, having smelled the pleasing odor of the sacrifice, determines that he will no longer, or he will never again, destroy the earth for the same reason that he initially destroyed it, because he recognizes that the human heart is evil from its youth, by which he means they're born that way. And being born that way, they can't be held responsible for their wickedness. Well, that takes care of the J story. And you want to notice that the J version of the creation story, the chronology is the Lord talks to Noah, gives him the warning, 7 days pass, then 40 days of flood caused by rain, then the birds, then 7 days, then the bird, then 7 days, then the exit and the sacrifice, for a total of 7 plus 40 plus 7 plus 7, or 61 days, start to finish. And that's the J version of the story. In the P version of the flood story, it begins by reintroducing Noah. Now, I didn't show it on this handout, but Noah and his sons are first introduced to the readers in a Yahwistic language at the end of, or perhaps actually in priestly language also, at the end of chapter 5. In chapters 6, verse 9, we're reintroduced to Noah and to his generations, as the text begins the way a typical genealogy or Toledo text begins in priestly documents like Genesis chapter 5, Genesis 6:9. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, and so forth. It identifies Noah and his sons, and it gives, again, a story about how God has decided to destroy the earth. And it gives a different, worded slightly differently, it gives a rationale for why Elohim wishes to destroy the earth, because to see in Genesis 6:12, remember, the J version has this material from the J version appears first. In the P version, it repeats a rationale, a divine rationale for destroying the world. It says, God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. And in verse 6:11, the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Notice that the focus is not here on the human or the heart of the human, but on all of the earth and all flesh. All animals are corrupted by violence. A characteristic feature of the P version of this material is that very explicit and detailed, numerically precise instructions for building the ark are given. And yet, at the same time, Elohim promises to Noah that he will make his covenant with Noah and his descendants. But he also tells him, and mind you, this is the first place in the actual, if you read it as a unified work, this is where you first encounter the instructions. Elohim says, bring 2 of every kind of creatures into the ark. Interestingly, he says, bring 2 of the birds as well, which is a little bit different than what we found. You'll see on the same page in the handout, what we found in the J material, which says bring 7 pairs of birds. The P material has Noah bringing only 2 pairs of birds. He also gets an instruction to bring food, which is a smart move because in the P version, the flood is much longer. The P version, like priestly materials in general, is very concerned with precise dating. And if you take a look at the handout that I provided called the Ages of the Patriarchs, you'll see that the P version lines up precisely. The dates of the patriarchs, which are mainly given in Genesis chapter 5, line up precisely with the date of the flood. So that, in fact, the 2 oldest patriarchs, Methuselah, Noah's grandfather, and Lamech, Noah's father, both die in the year of the flood. Their dates of their birth and their length of their lives correspond precisely with the 600th year of Noah's life, which is the year 1657 Anno Mundi. Anno Mundi being a way of referring to the years of the world since creation. And the priestly account in Genesis chapter 5 actually allows you to calculate the date of the flood as taking place in Anno Mundi 1657. It begins when Noah was 600 years old. He goes ahead and he takes 2 and 2, male and female, into the ark, just as Elohim commanded him. Then it specifies even more clearly when exactly this began. It began in the 600th year of Noah's life. In the 2nd month of that year, on the 17th day of that month. Now, why, you might ask, does it provide such calendrical precision? Well, it's very interesting. The first thing that it does is it tells you that, unlike the J version of this story in which God sends rain for 40 days and 40 nights, in the P version of this story, God doesn't send rain or doesn't just send rain. He does something very interesting. He opens up the windows of heaven, which does cause rain to come down. And this is rain that is coming down from the cosmic waters that are above the dome, that same dome that was found in the priestly account of creation that's found in Genesis chapter 1. And he also opens up the fountains of the deep, causing the waters from the abyss below the earth to come up And what basically we have happen here is a reversal of creation. If in creation, you'll recall, the world is created by separating the waters above and below the dome, in the priestly account of the flood, we have exactly a reversal of creation, an anti-creation, if you will. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Now, you'll notice that weaving into this material is the J notice, the material from the J story about the rain falling for 40 days and 40 nights. But if we stick with the P material, we'll notice in 7:13 that we're still on the day when Noah enters the ark, that second month, 17th day. And he brings 2 by 2, verse 7:15, into the ark. And they're still entering the ark in 7:16. In fact, they enter as God commanded them, and you get this strange little aside, and the Lord shut him in, which doesn't fit in with 7:12 or 7:17, because Noah's already on the ark in the J version. It's almost as though a third editor has answered a question that a child might ask about the ark, which is like, if Noah and his sons and all the animals went onto the ark, how did they seal the door from the outside? How could they have done that? They were inside the ark. And the answer of the editor is, well, God himself sealed them in the ark. But he uses the name Yahweh in order to indicate that sealing. So I don't think that that's actually a part of the original J narrative here. So they're in the ark. It's the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, the 17th day. And it explains that the waters swelled and increased greatly on the earth. And it says that everything died, everything gets covered. You get even the height, 15 cubits, that's 15 arm lengths above the tops of the mountains. This is some very deep water. I've attempted to draw the cosmology of Genesis chapter 1 rather crudely and quickly here on my whiteboard to try to share with you a little bit more of my thinking about what's going on here. As the waters above the heaven pour back through the windows in the heaven, they fill the space beneath the dome of heaven. And as the waters rise up through the apertures, the fountains of the great deep, they fill the space. So the waters come from above and they come from below as well. And as a result, the dome fills back up with water. The ark, of course, would float back up on top of this water. If I had animation, I'd be able to show that to you. And it goes above the tops of the mountains. Truly a reversal of creation, but the details are even closer when you look right back at the text. The ark floats on the face of the waters, verse 7:18. The waters swell mightily, all flesh died, and everything that has the breath of life died. And this is the language that's characteristic of the description of the death that's found in the priestly version of the flood story. And in continuing, the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days. Now, wait a second, 150 days, not 40 days, but 150 days. So if we started on the second month and the 17th day, how far did that take us? You don't have to ask, because the priestly writer will tell you exactly how far that takes you. It says in a very conventional way at the beginning of chapter 8 that God remembered Noah. And this is really a biblical idiom that doesn't imply, I think, that God's forgetful, but rather that God turns his attention to Noah only after the 150-day period is up. And it says, now remember that the ark is floating on the face of the waters, much like we had God's spirit hovering on the face of the waters at the beginning of creation in Genesis chapter 1. And he even says here, and God made a wind blow over the earth, and that caused the waters to subside. So after 150 days, the waters begin to subside when a wind from God blows over the face of the waters. They gradually recede, and at the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. Now, you might say, well, The Yahwist version, or what you're calling the Yahwist version, Dr. Baldwin, says in 717 that the flood continued for 40 days. And it says the rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, but it doesn't necessarily say it didn't go longer than that, right? It just says that there was rain for 40 days and 40 nights. But if you'll notice in the P version, it actually says that for 150 days, the floods continued. And then after the 150 days, in Genesis 8:2, then the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed and the rain from the heavens was restrained. So in the P version, in fact, the rain falls for that entire 150 days. At the end of the 150 days, the waters had abated. And it says, in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark comes to rest on one of the mountains. So the waters are starting to abate and drop down. The mountaintops appear, and the ark comes to rest on top of one of those mountains, a mountain in Ararat, which is modern day Armenia and ancient Armenia as well. It's interesting that it gives you that location, but it's not entirely clear. Hundreds of explorers throughout the centuries have gone in search of the remains of Noah's Ark, and I urge you not to believe your eyes when you see someone find it in a show on the History Channel. So now, I just want to point out that 150 days is also precisely 5 months here. It's the 7th month now and the 17th day of the month. Why so precise? Why indeed? But we're 150 days into the story now in the 600th year of Noah's life. And then it continues to say, the waters continue to abate for 3 more months. Well, almost 3 more months, until the 10th month on the 1st day of the month. So that's for another, let's see, 10th month, 1st day of the month, it's another 73 days. So now we're up to 223 days, and now the tops of the mountains are appearing. Then it goes on to say, Genesis 8:13, in the 601st year, in the 1st month, we're now almost a year into this story, and that's a long time to spend in an ark with a bunch of animals. The waters are now dried up from the earth, and Noah finally removes the covering from the ark. There's no birds in this version of the story. He looks and sees that the face of the ground is drying, but he waits another 1 month and 16 days or 1 month and 26 days to the 2nd month, the 27th day of the month, and then the earth is dry. So we're exactly 1 year and 10 days later after the flood. The chronology of the P version of the flood is 1 year and 10 days, or 370 days. Now, why did I say 370 days, you might add? Because it doesn't specify how long these months are. And the only days of the month that it specifies, for whatever reason, are the 1st, the 17th, and the 27th. It's hard to know for sure, right? Ancient calendars vary from peoples to people. And one thing that we know is that the Babylonians had a 12-year solar calendar, a 12-month solar calendar, and each month was thought to have 30 days. This did not line up with a lunar calendar, but it did have the advantage of nearly lining up with the true solar calendar, which we now know to be 365.25 days long. Just as we have to add a leap year every 4 years with a 1 leap day to make up that quarter day that's lost every year as the seasons recess against the cycle of the sun, of the earth going around the sun. You know, our calendar doesn't quite keep up with the progress of the seasons, and so our seasons recess by a whole day every 4 years. But we add an intercalary month of February 29th in order to make it up. In order to make up for the lost 5 days every year, the Babylonians would add in extra months every 6 years or so. Israelites eventually adopted a Babylonian solar-based calendar. But But they also used a lunar calendar. And the lunar calendar for a long time was set just by observing when the new moon took place. That's why throughout Israelite literature, you'll find references to new moons as one of the primary forms of festivals. Israelites observed the Sabbath every seventh day. And then once a month, they had a new moon festival marking the beginning of a new month. Now, how long is a lunar month? It turns out that a lunar month is actually 29 and a half days, plus about 44 minutes and 3 seconds, I'm told, according to modern astronomical measurements. The Israelites just marked the beginnings of these months by observation. And if you followed this out over any length of time, basically what the problem is that you can't have a 12-month year this way because you end up with only 354 days. And so you're going to recess from the solar year at the rate of almost half a month, or rather at the rate of about 10 or 11 days, or a third of a month every year. So you're going to fall rather quickly behind. And pretty soon your spring is going to be your winter and your summer is going to be your spring, and everything gets messed up. So the Israelites also practiced, kept their calendars aligned with the solar year and the seasons by putting intercalary months into place. So again, why, you might ask, is this flood exactly 1 year and 10 days long? Well, a clever scholar of the late 19th century once observed that if you add 10 days to the 354 days of the lunar year that would have been traditional among Israelite peoples, you get something that is very close to the actual solar year. 364 days is only a day and a quarter off of the actual solar year. And so it is conjectured by some that there's an underlying motive to the priestly chronology of the flood story, which is to provide a sort of etiology of the reconciliation of the lunar year and the lunar 12-month year and the solar 12-month year. A kind of interesting hypothesis, and one of the ones that I think makes best sense of this otherwise seemingly insignificant detail. But as I've said, everything in the text has significance. It's the Elohist material that includes the final element of the actual covenant, the Noahite covenant, and the discussion of the importance of the image of Elohim that is present in humankind, and the importance of the blood as the life, and the food rules that are given about not eating flesh with its blood. And that concludes my discussion, both of the chronology of the flood story, as it's found in the two different versions that have been woven together. My guess is that you never notice this sort of thing. Most people default to two things, one that comes from the J version and one that comes from the P version. In their own reconstruction of the flood story in their head, the one that we put into songs or tell children, we tell the story of a 40-day flood, which comes from the J version of the story. It's much easier to remember. It's simpler. It's symbolic and whole. It includes those birds and things like that. We tell that 40-day version of the flood story in terms of chronology, but we like the simple symmetry of the P versions, simple instructions of 2 by 2. And interestingly, the P version does not include the blood sacrifice, but has 2 of every kind of animal, including, I will add, the clean ones. I think you'll find this right in Genesis 7:8, where it actually claims that Noah brings only 2 of each kind of clean animal, even though it's already, the unified version of the story has already told you that according to Yahweh's command, Noah's brought 7 pairs. So that 2 by 2 procession, so that every painting you've ever seen of the child's painting of you've ever seen of the ark shows 2 of every kind of animal, clean or unclean. And the 40-day flood, which is the simpler chronology to remember, are the ones that stick together. Why have these 2 competing stories been brought together into one unified message? Well, I'll just finish this first part of our lecture number 8 by saying that Israelite scribes gathered the traditions of their ancestors during a very stressful time in Israelite history. And this we're going to get into further in the course a little bit later on. But the probable date of the composition of the final form of the Torah that we have today is during the Babylonian exile. After Judeans have been conquered by Babylon and taken forcibly into exile, they're clinging to their past and they're clinging to their identity and their knowledge of God. They're clinging to their ancestral traditions and stories, and they're doing it in a way that the only way they know how, which is to copy them and bring them forward. And we're faced with a hard choice about like which version of the flood story to tell. If you know more than one, why not just tell them both? But you don't want to pretend that there were 2 floods or represent as if there were 2 different flood stories. You want just one, so you bring them together. That may not be a fully adequate explanation. And I think that if I was going to stage this telling of the flood in a way that illustrated the fact that there are different sources at work, I would think instead about 2 storytellers competing with one another to tell the same story at the same time, the way that 2 friends might tell the story around a campfire. All right, more soon. Thanks for your attention. Lecture 8 continues in part 2.